I'm Steve Clemons. I'm a senior fellow here at the New America Foundation. This is like, you know, just old home week for me because I haven't been here for a while. As many of you know, I have another day job as editor-at-large over at The Atlantic and National Journal. But I do stop by and get my mail, and there are so many friends here today, which is terrific. So I know you're not here to see me. You're actually here to hear the content and discussion between two great friends, Richard Vague, who has just published this week, The Next Economic Disaster, Why It's Coming and How to Avoid It. I like succinct books. I like books, you know, I like books that get right to the point and tell you what you need to know and then set up the debate and then put out data, and then you can kind of either applaud it or rip it apart pretty quickly, and they don't obfuscate behind 900 pages. So I am, before we even get going, grateful for brevity and succinctness, and we'll then have to ask Sherle Schwenninger, who's the director of the Economic Growth Program here, a great colleague, co-founder of the New America Foundation, who's going to analyze and share with us whether it's a brilliant but succinct book or a challenged but succinct book. I want to recognize Senator Byron Dorgan, a great friend who's here in the second row, who's been a great voice on trade and economic policy for a long time. So I just want to tell you all in advance, he's got to get out at 6, so I don't care how many hands goes up, he gets the first comment or question. I won't let him filibuster though, so we'll have to see. But without further ado, please give Richard Vague a round of applause. Richard Vague, I should say, just to put this in context, Richard is, you know, he identifies himself as philanthropist and kind of an all-round good guy. Richard used to be really in the United States the king of the credit card business. So when Byron Dorgan would be up there and basically saying what's happening with credit cards and too much credit and you know, part of that bad line of bankers and credit card chiefs, Richard Vague was among them, which is why this project has become so interesting to me. Richard created, for those of you who have airline miles, you know, miles to donate to your universities, miles to buy food at Safeway. The Affinity credit card was essentially invented by Richard as the founding CEO of First USA Bank, which later went to Chase. He did the same thing again for Barclays. But he's an entrepreneur. But I think as he was going through this, and if I could just do a bit of a preamble, Richard, during the build-up to the 2008 financial crisis, he began looking at balance sheets and began looking at private levels of debt, private debt levels in relation to the value of properties that we're using to collateralize those loans. And he just knew that the equation didn't add up. And he'll tell a bit of this story, I think, where he began seeing that the banks were sitting on a house of cards way earlier than others, and that there was, in a sense, a kind of structural corruption, if you will, of the process, of the regulation, of looking at things that just weren't real. And so Richard had it there, and he's been on I think, an interesting project to begin looking at financial crises and their relations to private debt. We debate government debt. We like to go out, you know, as others have said, and kind of look at, you know, whether we're spending too much or not within the debt. If you have a financial crisis, you have countries like Spain and others that had very, very little government debt to GDP before their crisis. And where did those crises happen? They happened in the private sector debt markets. So I think that is the preamble that I will bring the former king of the American credit card business, who's here to talk about debt, to share with us what he thinks about the relationship between these and how strongly correlated they are to financial crises and anticipating them, and what should be the remedy for either protecting ourselves or dealing with them after that. So please give a round of applause to Richard Vague.
I am really, really grateful to be here today and to have all of you here with me. And a special thanks to Steve, who's done so much to help me as I put this book together, and to Sherle Schwenninger, who's done as much or more, and just want to express my real gratitude to you folks. You know, as Steve mentioned, you know, a lot of the debate these days is quantitative easing and government debt and stimulus versus austerity, and I'm going to argue that all those things are secondary considerations to private debt. And to get a little bit more into it, in his book Stress Test, Tim Geithner wrote, "Financial crises cannot be reliably predicted, so they cannot be reliably prevented." And furthermore, in the section on financial reform, which is an extensive legislative accomplishment, he said the goal was to make the system safe for failure. It wasn't to prevent failure. My comments today, I'm going to argue that financial crises can be predicted and can be prevented by focusing on private debt. Now, first, I think it's important to get a context for this. What I've done on this chart is map from 1997 to 2007 certain categories. This is the decade that built up to the financial crisis. And you can see here on the leftmost column, this is the growth in private debt from 1997 to 2007. That number increased by $14.4 trillion in one decade. The market was flooded with the creation of new money, because that's in essence what this is. Federal debt only increased by about $3.5 trillion. The money supply only increased a little over $4 trillion. The money supply only increased about $3 trillion. GDP itself only moved up to about $15 trillion. Some of these other numbers that we hear about again and again and again are tiny in relation to this number. The federal budget, federal taxes and exports. You could have reduced taxes by 10% for each of those 10 years, and you would have enabled $2 trillion to be spent in the private economy. That's a tiny number compared to the $14.4 trillion that was released through this massive buildup in private lending. The crisis of 07 and 08 was caused by a rapid increase in private debt. Here's the mortgage loan market. From 1970 to 2000, that amount grew by about 17% per year in ratio to GDP. Starting in 01, it took off on a rocket ship. It grew by $5 trillion. It doubled in about 6 years. That's a growth rate to GDP of 46%. And it wasn't just mortgages. If you look at private debt in total, and private debt is the sum of business debt and consumer debt, it's about 50-50 or 55-45. And consumer debt, which is around 12 trillion, 70% of that is mortgage debt. Some of these other categories we think about, like student lending, is only $1 trillion. Credit cards are only $600 billion. It's mainly mortgage debt. In total, that number grew in that 5 to 6 year period by over 20% to GDP. Now, businesses and consumers are still highly leveraged. We heard a lot about consumer deleveraging. Consumers have not deleveraged very much by historical standards. Furthermore, we're hearing a lot about how businesses are awash in cash. It's simply not true. If you look at it on a net basis, businesses are net debtors to begin with, and their net debt position is high by historical standards. We're still highly leveraged. Now, if we go beyond the U.S. crisis in 07 and 08, we see that this same rapid 5-year buildup in private debt happened in all of our major financial crises. You see it here in the 20s. See this rapid acceleration in private debt that preceded the crash of 1929? Here we see Japan's crisis of 91. 28% growth in 5 years prior to their crisis of 91. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened after the fact. It was in essence a deleveraging that created deflationary pressure. But the buildup of private debt is what brought the crisis. We see this in Asia in 97. There was a 29% growth in private debt to GDP in Korea in the period before the 97 crisis. You also see this in Indonesia here, about a 43% growth in the 5-year buildup. Now, in every single one of these cases, government debt to GDP is actually benign or improving in the 5-year period prior to the crisis. Here you see this dramatically in Spain. Spain, which of the major Eurozone countries is in the worst shape, and you can see why. There was 49% growth leading up to the crisis. They're now at a level of 216% private debt to GDP, an astonishing number. But look what was happening to the government debt prior to the crisis. It was actually improving in ratio to GDP. Businesses feel flush. Consumers feel flush. They're paying more taxes in a lending boom period. The government is receiving more revenue. Everybody feels like they're winning. When we examine this comprehensively for major economies, now I've taken the liberty to carve out the 22 economies that constitute 85% of world GDP and have $500 billion in GDP each or more. Frankly, 3 countries, Japan, China, and the United States, constitute 40% of world GDP, so it's a real crisis. And if you look at this, depending on whether you kind of are a lumper or a splitter, there's been 22 crises in these 22 major countries. Pretty much every one of them has seen a buildup of 20% or more in private debt to GDP in the 5 years prior to the crisis. The converse is true as well. Anytime you see a financial crisis, you see a buildup in private debt prior to that. Now, there's been a lot of focus on mortgage debt. A lot of folks have said, it's mortgage debt in this particular case. And it was in the U.S. 2008 crisis. But if you look across all these crises, it can be other forms of private debt. In Japan in '91, it was more commercial real estate. In South Korea in '97, it was more commercial real estate and industrial loan. All that matters is in aggregate, private debt is increasing at this 20% pace. The form of debt, by the way, also is not that relevant. We saw a lot of securitizations and a lot of credit default swaps in the 07-08 crisis in the United States, and as a result, a lot of people have become quite expert in those particular forms of lending. There have been a lot of crises where there wasn't securitizations and there wasn't credit default swaps. It's been other ways that banks have used to sidestep capital requirements. Another thing that I would note is sometimes in these crises you have delinked lending and risk. There's been a lot of commentary on the fact that in mortgage markets, the folks making the decisions about the loans that went into the securitizations didn't bear the risk of those loans, and those were borne by someone else. Well, that's true. And that's been true in a lot of crises, but there have been a lot of crises where that kind of delinking hasn't been that prevalent. The key is tracking the aggregates, and where you have 20% growth in private debt to GDP in 5 years, you pretty much got yourself an issue. Now, why is it that rapid growth in private lending creates a crisis? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Anytime that lending exceeds the GDP growth rate that much in that short of a period of time, it's evident that we've built too much of something, whether it's houses or office buildings or manufacturers. If you look back in the 1800s, it was railroads. You've built too much of something. And when you've built too much of something, there are 2 consequences. First of all, you've created a lot of bad loans. In the case of the 07-08 crisis, we probably created $2.5 trillion worth of problem loans. The banking system only has about $1.5 trillion worth of capital. You had a problem. And that's typical for this type of crisis. You're creating more bad loans than there is capital in the system to support that. The second thing that has happened is you've built so much capacity that growth is going to have to slow down until that capacity is absorbed. If you've built a 4 or 5 year supply of housing, you can't just wave a magic wand and have that disappear. It's going to take several years for that excess capacity to be absorbed. When you have these 2 things happen, monetary and fiscal policy are of limited benefit. Pretty much all the discussion has been about monetary and fiscal policy. Quantitative easing, stimulus, things like this. There's only so much those 2 things can do. They can soften the blow. They can't solve the problem. Another thing is that triggering events, be it a stock market crash or a bank failure, is often ascribed as the reason there was a crisis. It's not true. The cow's already out of the barn by the time the stock market crash or the bank failure has occurred. The excess lending has been occurring over years. And all the crashes and all the bank failure is evidence that it's happened. Another thing to note is that once runaway lending has started, and I'm terming this phenomenon of a 5-year rapid increase in lending, runaway lending, that can occur for years. As long as the banks keep lending, the party can continue to happen. Now, we've heard a lot of things about other reasons that these crises have occurred. We've heard theories from the black swan theory to it was government debt to it was current account deficits. We looked at all of the criteria on all of these countries. We examined 20 different factors, including government debt, including declining interest rates, including currency valuation, savings rates, current account deficits. The only one that correlates to crisis is a rapid buildup in private debt. None of these other factors are good predictors. They're either weak or non-existent factors in predicting this. So let's change the subject ever so slightly here. We've been talking about crises per se in the slides thus far, but apart from any crisis, the high level of private debt is a problem in and of itself. And I found this slide remarkable when I first came across it. But in 1950, private debt to GDP in the United States was 55%. Today, it's 156%. It's tripled in a little over 2 generations. And that's not just true in the United States. Here's all the major Western countries graphed, and I've thrown China in here for good measure. But in 1970, all these major economies were more in the range of 50 to 100% private debt to GDP. Today, they're kind of in the 125 to 150 to 200% range. The whole world is getting highly leveraged. And we've seen a lot of headlines over the past week or so about Portugal and another lending failure in Portugal. Here's Portugal. Private debt to GDP in Portugal is 255%. The problem there is not government debt. The problem there is not this and that and the other. The problem is accumulated private debt over time. Spain, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the outlier among the major Eurozone countries at 216%. When you have that much private debt, a very simple thing occurs, and that is money that consumers across the United States would be spending on restaurants and new cars and vacations and other goods and services, they are instead diverting to service a too high level of debt. That, in our mind, is the reason we're experiencing a lackluster recovery. We and Europe both. And frankly, the situation's more acute in Europe than it is in the United States. So that brings us to the issue of how do you prevent a crisis and how do you repair a situation where you have too much debt in the aftermath of a crisis. Well, I was in the banking industry for most of my career, and I can assure you that where regulators want to intervene, regulators can intervene. The key is monitoring the aggregates. If the regulators, the Fed, and all these associated entities are looking at the rate of growth of private debt to GDP, it's fairly easy to see years in advance a problem developing. Regulators can then influence countercyclical credit policies. The Federal Reserve, frankly, could use private debt growth as a factor in setting interest rates. They can intervene with strengthened capital requirements. There's a lot of things they can do when they see this kind of thing developing. Which leads us to the problem of repair. You've had a crisis. You're sitting there with too much debt. How do you get out of a situation like we currently have, frankly, across the world, where we have too much private debt to GDP? Well, you could have folks pay down that debt, but that brings economic contraction in and of itself. We saw this, frankly, that was the reason for the astonishing contraction in the period 1930 to 33. We could grow, but there's never been a period in modern economic history where you've had GDP growth that was not matched or exceeded by private debt growth. You could inflate your way out of this, but frankly, we've run these models every which way we could think of, and it takes a generation or more to get out of this if you rely on inflation. That only leaves one thing by process of elimination. That's restructuring debt. We have probably on the order of 9 million mortgages that are underwater today out of the 55 million mortgages in the United States. A broad-scale program to go to those consumers, however politically unpopular it might be, would go a long way to boosting the economy, because the net effect would be that money is freed up to spend on goods and services. Restructuring would have a salutary effect on GDP growth. It's no mystery to me why our economic recovery tends to be less than we would hope for. Now that brings us to just a couple of more slides that I have before I turn the podium over to Sherle, and that is the current situation in China. Runaway debt growth in China is at alarming levels. Here you see the history back to '97. What we've suggested is that a growth rate of 20% or more in a 5-year period is one that should bring concern. The growth rate in China, and by the way, the numbers are a little fuzzy and you get slightly contradictory numbers from different sources, but no matter which ones you rely on, you're looking at growth rates that's in excess of 40 to 50%. Now, where does this show up? I think probably everybody in this room has read a lot about the problems in China associated with overcapacity. There are many cities that they are referring to as ghost cities that are virtually empty cities of gleaming new buildings. We also see a lot of reports about excess capacity in manufacturing. It's capacity that's being added to keep the Chinese economy growing that is not justified by demand and is resulting in increased levels of overcapacity. So what is our view of what's going to happen in China? Well, we think a crisis is possible in 2 to 3 years. Now, the mitigants are very important to focus on. China has only about 32% central government debt to GDP. Now that's low by world standards. Ours is about 100%. Japan's is about 200%. So they have lots of additional borrowing capacity. They are also, through the PBOC and other places, holders of vast financial assets. In both cases, the capacity is, we estimate, easily equal to 20 to 30% of GDP. So China does have capacity to deal with this problem. But even if a crisis is avoided, China has significant and increasing levels of overcapacity. Now here's a little paradox for you. You know, China released its GDP number here less than a week ago, and it was 7.5%. And everybody was relieved. Oh my goodness, that's great news. They're still growing at 7.5%. We don't need to worry. GDP growth is more a measure of the capacity being added than it is a measure of the capacity that's needed. So at a 7.5% growth number in China's economy is just evidence that the problem is compounding. China needs to pull back on their growth rates just to absorb the excess capacity they already have. We believe China's situation may be very similar to the one that we have seen in Japan. Japan had this exact situation, rapid run-up in private debt leading to 91, and 23 to 24 years of sideways growth in the period after that. You can see something like that being the case for China once they come to grips with their problem. Our view is what they will do and what they should do is act preemptively. Meaning, you know, it's a situation unlike the United States where the government, in effect, owns the banks. So their mandate for keeping those banks alive is different and frankly more compelling than it was in the United States. It's hard to see them not acting. But what they need to do is go in and preemptively recapitalize the banks so that those banks can in turn go and renegotiate with commercial borrowers. China has about $14 trillion in commercial loans. We estimate that easily $1 to $2 trillion of that is bad loans. It may be quite a bit higher than that. They have the capacity to preemptively deal with that. But once they do that, they're going to be faced with this decelerating growth scenario, and they're going to have the unemployment problems that they've been trying to outrun all along. And that's where they probably have to look at expanded safety net programs to deal with the social ramifications of slower growth. We think in aggregate the cost to the Chinese economy could be 20 to 40% of GDP. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sherle.
Properly introduce Sherle. Thank you very much. Glad to see you. I have to have the commas. I'm the punctuation point between speakers. So thank you very much, Richard. I just want to underscore how unusual it is to have a person that was responsible for so much building of debt in America talk about there being too much. And I just wanted to say that Byron, your jaw might have dropped had you heard that testimony in the Senate. I want to thank Sherle Schwenninger for offering some commentary. I want to recognize Michael Lind, who's been his partner here at the Economic Growth Program. Both of them will work together on aspects of this. But Sherle, I'm looking forward to you to tearing up the book. Sherle Schwenninger.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Richard. We've been working alongside with Richard for the past few months and have issued several reports. The title of one is on the slide here, America's Debt Problem, how private debt is holding back growth and hurting the middle class. We also issued an earlier report called The U.S. Economy After the Great Recession, America's Deleveraging and Recovery Experience, and we will issue in the fall a report on the China's debt problem. We actually might begin, if I can manage here, I don't know if, we actually might begin as sort of, I'm not going to cover all this, so don't worry about it.
But it's intriguing tease.
We might actually begin where Richard left off, which is with the China